Damn it! The billionaire swore, his voice cutting through the storm's howling winds and relentless downpour. The sound of his frustration echoed over the turbulent day as he sped down the winding road. He was on his way to seal a life-changing billion-dollar deal when suddenly, boom, his car lurched violently, swerving toward the side of the road. One of the tires had blown out, and in an instant, his situation went from bad to worse. With no cell signal in sight, Chris was trapped in the middle of nowhere, feeling completely helpless. The minutes ticked away, and all he could do was stand there, staring at the tire, knowing there was nothing he could do to fix it. But just as the hopelessness began to set in, out of nowhere, 3 young black boys appeared, laughing and chatting among themselves. "Need some help, sir?" one of them asked, their voices bright against the backdrop of stormy chaos. Just 20 minutes later, the situation had been completely transformed. The boys had effortlessly replaced the damaged tire, all while joking and working together like a well-oiled machine. Chris, still in disbelief, reached for his wallet to offer them a reward, but the boys refused it with a smile. Then, just a few days later, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of the boys' home, delivering gifts that were far beyond anything they'd expected. What a twist of fate. It makes you wonder, can acts of kindness truly come full circle? Reflecting on this true story, we are reminded of the power of generosity and community. It's a lesson worth thinking about. But before we dive deeper into that, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on daily inspiring stories like this. Share your thoughts with us in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear your story too. Now, let's take a closer look at the rain-soaked situation Chris was in. It had been relentless, pouring down in sheets as the storm battered everything in its path. Chris, a self-made billionaire, was in his luxury black Mercedes, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as the storm raged on. He had to be in the city for a critical meeting in just 45 minutes, a meeting that could change everything for him. But nature had other plans. The rain pounded down on the roof of his car like a drum, each drop a reminder of his dwindling time. His windshield wipers swiped furiously back and forth, struggling to clear the glass. With every passing second, it became harder to see as the storm grew fiercer. The clock on his dashboard loomed ominously, only 45 minutes until his pivotal meeting. Chris had always prided himself on being in control. He was the type of person who had everything planned out, no surprises. But today, control slipped through his fingers like sand. The car jolted sharply, followed by the unmistakable thud of a flat tire.
Boom.
Thump, thump, thump. "Damn it," Chris muttered, cursing the situation. He pulled the car over onto the narrow shoulder, his frustration growing by the second. He stepped out into the pouring rain, the icy droplets soaking through his suit in seconds. The wind whipped around him, cold and unforgiving. The ground was slick, and each step felt like a battle against the storm. Opening the trunk, Chris surveyed the spare tire and the tools he had no clue how to use. Changing a tire was not part of his skill set. He had people for that, professionals who took care of these things. But here he was, stranded in a desolate stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but wide-open fields and hills, no sign of civilization in sight. His phone? No signal. He cursed again, this time louder. Damn it. His meeting was slipping further and further out of reach, and with it, the chance to seal that billion-dollar deal that could propel him to even greater heights. If he didn't get to that meeting, he would lose out on everything. His professional reputation, his career, everything he'd worked so hard for. Just as Chris was about to give up, he heard faint laughter cutting through the howling winds. He squinted into the distance and saw 3 figures pedaling toward him on bicycles. They were black boys, no older than 15, their laughter ringing out over the rain-soaked world. As they neared, Chris noticed their mismatched raincoats, each splattered with mud from their journey. Their carefree attitude contrasted sharply with his own rising stress. The tallest of the 3, a boy with curly hair and a worn blue raincoat, called out, "Hey, mister, need some help?" Chris blinked in disbelief, unsure whether to believe his eyes. But with no other choice, he nodded, muttering, yeah. I got a flat tire. Not sure you can help, though. He gestured toward the damaged rubber, feeling a little embarrassed at the thought of asking for help from such young boys. But the boy in the blue raincoat, Ethan, flashed a confident grin. His two friends, Tony and Peter, nodded enthusiastically, as if they had done this 100 times before. We've done this loads of times, Ethan said. Well, mostly on bikes, but it's the same idea. Chris hesitated, unsure. But Ethan wasn't waiting for permission. He handed his bike off to Tony and got to work, kneeling down to inspect the tire. You got a spare? He asked, looking up at Chris. In the trunk, Chris replied, stepping aside to let them get to work. The boys moved with surprising efficiency, each taking on a specific role, as if they had practiced this routine before. Tony retrieved the jack and wrench from the trunk, while Peter steadied the car. Ethan, the leader, began loosening the lug nuts with steady hands, his concentration sharp despite the rain. Chris watched, a bit skeptical. You don't mind getting wet? He asked, his voice tinged with both surprise and curiosity. It's just rain, Peter said with a shrug. We're already soaked anyway. And soaked they were. But it didn't stop them. As they worked, Chris marveled at their teamwork. Despite the storm, they moved quickly, chatting and laughing as if they were on some kind of adventure, not performing a task that most people would have balked at. Tony passed tools with precision, Peter steadied the car, and Ethan took charge of replacing the flat tire, all in record time.
Done,
Ethan announced triumphantly, wiping his muddy hands on his raincoat. The tire had been replaced in what felt like no time at all. Chris stood there, stunned. It wasn't just the speed or efficiency that impressed him. It was the sheer generosity and joy with which these young boys had helped a complete stranger, without asking for anything in return. With a satisfied grin, Chris looked at the repaired car and then at the three boys, still in disbelief. You really pulled it off, he asked, his voice a mix of astonishment and gratitude. It was almost as if he couldn't fully comprehend the simplicity of what had just happened. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a stack of crisp bills.
Here, take this.
You've earned it. But Ethan, the leader of the trio, waved him off with a smile. No need, mister. We were just passing by and thought we'd help. Tony and Peter nodded in agreement, the same humble grins on their faces. Besides, you need to get to where you're going, Tony added, his words simple but meaningful. Chris stared at them, utterly baffled. He was used to kindness, but this was different. No hidden motives, no expectations. Just pure, unselfish generosity. Are you sure? It's the least I can do, he insisted, hoping they'd reconsider. Ethan smiled, shaking his head. We're sure. Just drive safe, okay? With that, the boys hopped back onto their bikes, pedaling away into the downpour. Their laughter rang out, faint but distinct, as they disappeared into the storm. For a long moment, Chris stood there, his mind racing. As the boys faded from view, something unfamiliar stirred within him, a feeling that went beyond simple gratitude. Something deeper. He climbed back into his car and glanced at the now functional dashboard clock. There was still time to make it to his meeting, but as he drove, it wasn't the meeting that consumed his thoughts. It was the boys, their genuine kindness, their ease, and their willingness to help without wanting anything in return. It was an impact far greater than he could have imagined. With a renewed sense of urgency, Chris pressed the pedal down, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as the repaired car sliced through the wet, rain-soaked road. The storm outside continued to rage, but his focus was sharper now, his mind working through the ripple of emotions the boys had sparked in him. The meeting was important, yes, but their actions had left a mark that lingered far longer than he'd expected. He arrived at the towering glass skyscraper just as the rain began to ease. The valet rushed over with an umbrella, offering it to Chris as he stepped out of the car, adjusting his damp suit. The attendant gave him a curious glance, noting the muddy smudges on his cuffs. Chris, however, brushed it off with a curt nod. There was no time to explain. Inside, the conference room buzzed with activity. His team was already there, shuffling papers, whispering amongst themselves, preparing for the meeting ahead. The clients, a group of investors, sat at the far end of a long mahogany table, their faces unreadable, their expressions cold and professional. Chris took his seat at the head of the table, forcing his mind to snap back into focus. This was the moment. A deal worth billions, a merger that could define his future. He leaned forward, bringing his usual commanding presence back into the room as he began to present his vision. His words flowed with precision, his answers sharp and calculated, just as they always were. But, as he spoke, a part of his mind drifted back to the boys. Ethan's confident grin, Tony's steady hands, Peter's casual shrug. The way they had worked together seamlessly, laughing and chatting like it was an adventure. They hadn't asked for anything, not even a thank you. They had simply helped, expecting nothing in return. Their selflessness, their genuine spirit, left a deeper impact than any deal or success ever could. As the meeting stretched on, Chris found himself distracted. His voice faltered once, then twice. His team exchanged surprised glances. They knew him as a man who could command a room with his focus and sharpness, but today was different. Today, there was something more introspective tugging at him, and it felt like the very drive that usually pushed him forward had been muted. His thoughts kept drifting back to the three boys. By the time the meeting wrapped up, Chris had successfully sealed the deal, but it felt less satisfying than he had hoped. The clients filed out of the room, shaking his hand and congratulating him, but Chris barely heard their words. He nodded absently, already lost in thought. Back in his office, Chris loosened his tie and sank into his leather chair, staring out at the city skyline. Rain streaked the glass, a reminder of the storm still lingering over the metropolis. On any other day, he would have been celebrating, basking in the rush of accomplishment that came with closing such a monumental deal. But today was different. His mind wasn't on the deal, it was on the boys. He replayed the moment when he reached for his wallet, expecting them to accept his offer. Their refusal had caught him off guard, shaking him in a way he couldn't explain. In his world, everything had a price. Generosity was often calculated, something you used to build connections or influence. But those boys had given him something more. They had given him their time, their effort, with no expectation of anything in return.
It was a concept so simple yet so foreign to him.
Chris leaned back in his chair, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He remembered Ethan's confident grin, Tony's calm demeanor, Peter's easygoing nature. They had shown him a type of selflessness he hadn't encountered in years, and it left him questioning something he couldn't quite define. The storm outside began to clear, the city lights shimmering against the wet streets below. As he watched the rain fade into the distance, Chris made a decision. He would return to that small town, not out of obligation, but because he needed to. He needed to do something more, something that felt meaningful. He didn't know yet what that would look like or how the boys would react, but for the first time in years, Chris felt a spark of purpose, something that went beyond boardrooms, beyond billion-dollar deals. He knew that this, more than anything he had achieved, was worth pursuing. The next morning, Chris woke earlier than usual, his mind clear. The firm, the world, all of it could wait.